Pablo Unido, Marcela Diaz.
We're just going to have our presenters sit with us.
That's great.
And before we begin, I also
into okay, I think you have to mute. I also wanted in a room that we have members or Felicia and Shani, I see you came in as well. I'm so sorry, but if you all want to stand up and introduce yourselves. Shani Harvey is the chair of the Sustainable Economy Task Force, which is the near the sister organization to the Sustainable Economy Advisory Council. Shani?
Yeah, sure. My name is Shani Harvey. I run the Economic Development Department, Justice, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion program. So I run our JEDI office. I took over as the Sustainable Economy Task Force chair for the council when our previous employee Joanna Nelson transitioned to the city of Santa Fe Economic Development. So I'm chair for that group right now, and with me I have Lisa Valletta and Felicia DePaula, who are also members of the JEDI team. And we help do the admin work for both of these groups. And our work is about expanding access and accessibility for all New Mexicans to jobs in a thriving economy. So that's the work that we do. So we're here to listen, support, and serve however we can. Thank you for having us. Thank you, James.
Thank you both. Thank you all three. Excuse me. Presenters, please take it away.
Gabe, are you going to do introductions or shall I?
Why don't you go ahead, and I think you need to share a slide deck, and then if you do, it'll appear for the Zoom as well as in here.
Sure, I'll go ahead and begin. So let me share my screen.
I'll go ahead and start us off. Myself, representing the Center for Social Policy at the University of New Mexico, Gabe Sanchez. Thank you, members of the committee, for allowing us time to present our research. As noted, this is a deeper dive into this particular region, the southeastern quadrant of the state of New Mexico. As noted, my team at the university did a comprehensive study around clean energy transition specific to workforce for the Department of Workforce Solutions. And this is, in essence, moving forward in a deeper dive in this particular region, and particularly talking to the frontline workforce, oil and gas workers, their families, and those that are directly connected to the industry. So myself and Dr. Sanchez Youngman are representing our larger team. As you can see, we had a couple of research assistants that also supported this work. And this is only part of a larger picture of data we hope to collect in this particular quadrant that'll go beyond just thinking about renewable energy and all other potential avenues for workforce. The main research question being, what can we do now to prepare infrastructure-wise for jobs and opportunities for continued employment for this workforce that obviously has high concerns that as oil and gas jobs move, they might be left out of the equation in terms of thinking about other job opportunities and job training and reskilling. So with that, I'll allow my colleague, we'll start off our presentation, and then I'll jump back in to present the second half.
Good afternoon. Again, my name is Shannon Sanchez Youngman, and just to begin our presentation, what we'd like to do is to start out, let me minimize this. Just to start out, we'd like to give some context about why the southeastern region is so vital to New Mexico as we transition to a renewable energy economy. So as many of you know, New Mexico's population really only grew by 2.8% in the last decade. But within our state, we've seen significantly higher growth in the southeastern region. And so I just want to present you with some quick statistics so that we can get a context for the population that's really living in the southeastern region, or otherwise known as the Permian Basin. So if we look at Chavez County, we see that overall in the county, there was actually a decrease in the population from 2010 by close to 1%. But when we look at the Hispanic and Latino population, we're seeing dramatic increases in each of these counties. So as you see here, we see 8.7% increase in Chavez, which is really relevant to our study because many of the oil workers that we surveyed and did focus groups live in this area, and they're often driving to Artesia or even to Texas for their jobs. In Eddy County, which is considered another part of the Permian Basin, we're seeing a Latino increase by 31.9%. And in Lee County, as you see here, we're seeing dramatic increases both in the general population and in the Latino population at a sizable 36.7%. Now, these statistics are really important for the context of the study because many of the oil workers and those who are working in industries closely associated with oil and gas are Latino and immigrant. So this is a very important thing for us to consider as we're moving forward in building infrastructure in the state. Just to go a little further, Lee County is really an example of the extreme salience of the immigrant workforce to the oil and gas industry. As most of you probably know, Lee County produces more oil than any other county in the US. Additionally, Lee County has a foreign-born population of 17.5%, which is higher than the national average and much higher than New Mexico's foreign-born population. So when we're talking about oil and gas workers in these counties, we're predominantly talking about Hispanic workers, Latino workers, with a sizable portion of foreign-born workers who've actually been around the state for a long time. So moving past some basic context, I'm going to tell you a little bit about our current workforce study and just go over some of the basic methods. So as Dr. Sanchez mentioned, we are giving you some preliminary findings from our early work. Our study is ongoing and we have more data to collect. But just to give you some background, again, the UNM Center for Social Policy is working in partnership with Somos Un Pueblo Unido, and we're really trying to collect information from residents of southeastern New Mexico who are either directly or indirectly connected to the oil and gas industry. So in our sample, we're talking to employees or retired employees of oil and gas companies or their spouses. And we're also talking to employees of the many industries that support the oil and gas industry in the region. We're doing a mixed methods design to understand the perceptions and needs of oil and gas workers, which includes a qualitative element, which is focus groups that we've conducted in Hobbs and Roswell. So far in our study, we've conducted 3 focus groups, and we talked to a total of 28 participants. We're also coupling our qualitative design with a survey, a quantitative survey. And thus far, we've included 50 interviews that have been conducted either in person, over the phone, in both English and Spanish. And I should say that when we conducted our focus groups, all of them were conducted in Spanish first, honoring the fact that most of the oil workers that live in that region predominantly speak Spanish. Now, there's a common misperception out there that people who are living and working in the southeastern region are fairly new to that area. But in reality, what we're finding is that most of the people we've talked to are very long-term residents in this state, with a robust 77% who have lived in this area for at least 10 years, and 42% have lived there more than 20 years. So when we're talking about workers from this area, we're talking about people who have lived in the community for many years, and now we're seeing multiple generations of workers in the area. So just to begin the study, the first thing that we really want to talk about is what we're learning about the working conditions and resources that are available to the oil and gas workforce in the region. So let's take a look at some of our early survey data. One thing that we're learning, and something that is really bears out in other studies, is that accidents are very common for oil and gas workers. So as you see here, 46% of respondents have reported an accident on the job, which is a high proportion. And a whopping 42% that said that this accident caused permanent damage. To get a little more granular, what we show you here in this bar chart is that the kind of accidents occur vary, with 23% being something like being struck by an object or equipment, all the way down to falling and getting injured, okay? Importantly, the survey is also finding that accidents are severe, but they're largely considered preventable for oil and gas workers in New Mexico. When we asked folks if they felt that their accident was preventable, a large 83.83% said yes. And quite alarmingly, when we asked folks if they had any coworkers who have had accidents or died, you'll see here that almost 27% of people we talk to know someone that has died. So the data collaborates other empirical evidence which suggests that working in oil and gas, the oil and gas industry is dangerous, accidents are common, and they are often preventable. Now, when we were able to conduct focus groups with folks from the community, we found lots and lots of stories and three major themes. So I'm going to walk you through some of our preliminary themes. So in conjunction with the survey data, we found that in our focus groups that workers report unsafe working conditions, injuries that often lead to disability and death, and most importantly, workers really talk about a proper health and safety net that is there for them when they are hurt. And so what I've done for you today is I'm displaying just a couple of quotes, a couple of anecdotes that people have told us. But these are common stories that we heard when we talked to workers in the southeastern region. We predominantly have heard that the most dangerous thing in the industry is explosions, that explosions are quite common. And when we talk to people in the room, people really commonly knew someone that had either died or had been severely disabled from an accident. In addition to just the occupational hazards of living and working in the industry, when people have accidents, a common theme that is occurring is that folks are telling us that they are often fired or they are offered money when accidents happen. So when accidents occur, workers are often left behind. And I think the quote to my right is a really powerful illustration of this. This was said by a woman whose husband has worked in the oil and gas industry for about 20 years. She said her husband was working for a company and had an accident. He almost cut his whole finger off unloading equipment. The owner didn't want to have problems, so they fired him. When he returned to other work in the field, she said that he got really skinny and described that he was drying up because of all the chemicals he was working with. And perhaps most importantly, she said that these tanks are like death. We experience disillusionment, impotence, and anger because we are completely hopeless. The manager of that company is my husband's nephew, but profit for the owner comes first. Now, just in our brief exploration of focus groups, this is a common story. So moving forward, we have to consider how these working conditions have affected the long-term residents of this region. We're also finding, not unsurprisingly, that oil and gas workers report that long working hours, long traveling distances, and separation from families contribute to poor mental health, substance abuse, and a lot of people talked about disruptions of the family. So one of our male participants was actually an engineer. He was born and raised from the area. And he said that when he worked in the field, he basically went through 2 marriages, and that the company told him that a third wife would work out because he was in the field long enough to teach them how it works and to advance enough so that he had a little more time home. So we're hearing lots and lots of stories about how workers are often gone for 20 days of time working, and that this kind of working condition is really putting strains on families. Another thing that we're learning a lot about is that folks who live in this region are often commuting very long distances when they're traveling to work. We're hearing about people who are living in more remote areas that travel to Artesia, but also we're really learning that many folks are now getting in their cars and they're driving across the border to Texas because the wages are a little higher. Very commonly and across all of our groups, we heard people talk about the highway between New Mexico and Texas as a road of death because many accidents occur there. And one of our participants said that just last week, and we talked to folks a week ago, that 3 people had died. So one of the common pejorative effects of living and working in the industry is that people are driving long distances, falling asleep at the wheel, and dying. Folks consistently also said about how well oil pays, but the thing is, you have to leave your family to go work long hours. And the picture I'm illustrating here is something that a lot of the men in our focus groups talked about. They talked about living and working in man camps, and that the situation is so far that what's happening a lot of the times is that when a male oil worker goes into the field, they're living in what they call man camps, and they rent trailers from their employers, and they live together for up to 20 days at a time. Finally, we had a good number of females who participated in our initial focus groups. And we really consistently are finding that female workers also report unsafe working conditions, but their conditions look a little different. Women predominantly said, and we talked to a lot of women welders, that the situation just isn't set up for women. So for example, there aren't bathrooms out on drills. So women have nowhere to go to the bathroom, for example. And in many instances, when we started having deeper discussions with folks, people really talked about the dangers of living and working around man caps, and that sexual assault is a common issue for women who are trying to work in the fields. And so here, what I've given you is just a few examples of what people have said. You know, some of the issues that women and female oil workers face are very similar to what other females face in other fields. A good one is that it's good pay, but very long hours. And one of our participants talked quite poignantly about, as a woman, it's very hard to be there because it's hard work, because you have to get up very early and you get home very late. And then I still have to do the things that need to get done at home. So that's just a sample of some of what we're finding when we're trying to explore in a little more depth about the living and working conditions of those folks who really are on the ground day to day, living and working in the Permian Basin. Now, I'm just going to talk for a few minutes about the benefits, and then I'll turn it over to Gabe, who's going to talk about training and skills and moving forward. So something else that we've been exploring quite a lot in our quantitative survey is trying to get an understanding of what benefits are really available to this workforce. And one of the interesting things that you see here is that it looks like for a small portion of the workforce, there is some benefits. As this bar tells us, we do see that less than a quarter, so some have health insurance, a small portion receive overtime, and much smaller portions receive retirement or paid sick leave, okay? So benefits exist, but they're not widely given. And probably most importantly, we're seeing that over 69% of oil and gas workers have been laid off or have had their hours cut when the market dips. So as many of you probably know, the lived experiences of workers is that they suffer enormously from bust, right? And a whopping 78% of respondents did not have access to unemployment benefits. So the results are pretty simple. When there's a boom, wages are good, but when there's a bust, people really suffer. Now, another thing that we're finding in our qualitative data is that even for those that have benefits, when accidents occur, they often disappear. So the story that I'm elucidating here is very common, and we heard many stories like this. So as you see, this particular gentleman who was permanently injured, his hand on the job from hogs, worked in the industry for 16 years. He says he was forced to quit by my boss when a pipe burst, as we took out the old pipe and installed the new one, and I almost lost a finger. The injustice for me is that they offered me a check of $200 for my finger and no medical care or meaningful compensation. I threw the money back to them. A metal then hit me and knocked some of my teeth out, and they didn't provide workers' compensation. They didn't give me anything. The way that companies get away with this is that they claim to give us safety training to prevent accidents, but they don't give us the necessary equipment that we need. Then, when accidents happen, the supervisors protect themselves in meetings because they say they are giving us the training and we shouldn't be getting hurt. Even if you look for an attorney, they will take the company's side. So what's really important in this man's story is something we heard over and over again so far. And that is that from the worker perspective, safety training often serves as a tool for employers to negate Dr. Sanchez, who's going to talk to us a little bit about training.
Thank you, Dr. Sanchez-Young. Before you begin, Gabe, I wanted to also acknowledge, I believe, Cabinet Secretary Sarita Nair has joined us. So welcome, thank you for joining us from the Department of Workforce Solutions. And I believe we may also have someone from the speaker's office, is Marissa Esquivel here? Hi, Marissa, thank you for joining us. Dr. Sanchez.
Thank you, Shannon. So I'll pick up where Dr. Sanchez-Youngman left off and say that part of what we're doing here is digging deeper into this particular quadrant from our prior workforce solution study that folks should take a look at. It was comprehensive in terms of trying to look at access to training, skill building, et cetera. What was the missing link from that study is we did not credit to the Somos team for saying, look, that was a limitation of your study. Can we actually talk to those folks and see how their attitudes, experiences, and so forth compare to the wider population? And part of that effort was looking specifically at access to training and skill building opportunities. So we asked, again, these are predominantly oil and gas workforce. What kind of trainings have you received at your job? And you see a relatively small segment, just over 1 out of 4, indicate that they've had any safety or hazard trainings, right? And so you put the very dismal story that Shannon laid out for you in terms of the high levels of accidents, the severity of those accidents and the consequences with the relatively small number of employees that actually have access to any training, much less whether or not they felt that training was effective. You see very small segments have access to technical skill trainings, quality assurance trainings. And for me, a couple of the more important items are that when folks are asked, look, and we talk to them in the focus groups as well, do you have opportunities for upward mobility to move up into the position and move away from the more dangerous entry-level jobs that you started with? And you see only 7% of the workforce that we've talked to indicated that they had any of those type of leadership development, management trainings, or others that would allow them to move up, so to speak, within the company. Probably one of the more glaring statistics from our overall presentation is that if you look at the segment of the population, again, only 26% who had any safety or hazard trainings, we asked them a follow-up question. Do you feel that the training is adequate to keep you and your coworkers safe on the job? You see it's roughly split down the middle. Half are saying, yes, the trainings actually are effective, but clearly a large segment of the population, a small segment that even has trainings, indicate that they're not very useful in terms of actually preventing risk for the very scary things that Dr. Sanchez-Youngman shared with us that the workforce is experiencing. Next slide. As Shannon noted, and I won't go into too much detail here, one of the things that we're very concerned with is that even though a very small segment of this population has access to any safety training in general, it seems as though all it's intended to do is essentially cover the companies if there's any accidents in place. And I won't read all of these quotes to you, but you see that at the end of the day, the workforce unfortunately doesn't have anybody looking out for their collective interests, right? The companies obviously have their legal teams, they have infrastructure behind them. And we heard a lot from the workforce that the surrounding legal community often seems as though they're somewhat in the pockets of the rich industry that is supporting the entire region. And so who's left to pick up the slack and maintain some level of support, leverage, power, if you will, for the actual workforce. Unfortunately, not much. Next slide, please. So one of the things that we wanted to do with this study is look at the experiences of this particular workforce today, but also look forward and try to get information from, again, the frontline workforce on what are they looking for in terms of emerging industries. Here, we're looking pretty specifically at renewable clean energy. I think moving forward, we want to broaden that perspective and look at all alternative paths for economic development and what the overall attitudes, what desires does this particular workforce have in terms of future employment, again, if oil and gas jobs dry up for them. Next slide. Very positively, and I'll say I've been polling in New Mexico for probably 15 going on 20 years. For a pollster like myself to ever see 100% of New Mexicans to ever agree on anything is extremely rare, as you all might imagine. So the fact that every single person that we talked to, 100% of respondents, said that they would take job training programs if they were available to them and convenient, I think speaks to how much this particular workforce wants to stay in the region, how much they value living in New Mexico and providing for their families. When we ask them follow-up questions in terms of, what type of job training availability would you prefer specific to the southeastern region to prepare for jobs outside of oil and gas industry, you see a wide range of items getting support. Whether they're online courses they could take based on their own work schedule, again, to get training in other industries, whether it's on-the-job training or apprenticeship programs, in-person classes at community college or training centers here in their communities. So you see physical distance being a key priority. Folks want accessibility where they live for these classes, whether it's night classes offered after normal work hours. Again, remember, these folks are providing for their families at very long hours. So job training is going to have to be accommodating to their very long schedules. Or looking at English language classes, etc. You see high levels of support and interest for retraining opportunities. Unfortunately, what I can tell you from our workforce solutions study, again, conducted about 2 years ago, part of that overall comprehensive study looks specifically at the infrastructure for job training. Our institute at one of our centers, Cradle to Career Policy Institute, that's very well respected for education research here in the state of New Mexico, actually analyzed our higher education system, including our 2-year colleges and universities, to look at where within the state are job training opportunities available right now. And unfortunately, the southeastern quadrant was not one of the high priority areas in terms of their research. In fact, if I showed you their map, as you might imagine, most job training is available in the urban areas. Up north, like here in Santa Fe, Albuquerque, etc., very few opportunities that meet what the workforce actually wants. Job training in their community where they don't have to drive long distances to be able to get access to that training. Next slide, please. One of the common themes from our overall research, both the qualitative and the survey data, is there's high-level concerns about jobs leaving the region. As you might imagine, these oil and gas workers and their families have heard a lot about the potential transition to renewable energy, and they're very worried about what that might mean for their individual family's livelihood. You see 63% of these folks indicate that their families are very worried that they might have to move away from this particular region if oil and gas jobs leave. 68% of this workforce and their families indicate that they're very worried good paying jobs will be leaving this area of the state that will not be replaced by any other industries. This is consistent with all the other research that we've done overall, not just with oil and gas workforce, but the overall population, who is incredibly worried if these jobs leave, what's going to happen? What's going to replace that will provide the same level of wages, the same level of opportunity to provide for families, despite the fact that you're hearing from the workforce limited access to resources in terms of training, very limited access to benefit. Next slide, please. One of the things that we heard loud and clear from our qualitative data, again, pretty robust number of focus groups when we think about specifically oil and gas workers in this quadrant of the state, these folks want to be involved. They want to be involved in the conversations about training, new industries, what could happen in terms of economic development, not just for their families, but the overall region. You see that when we ask folks broad questions like, what would make a viable community here in the Permian Basin? You heard folks say, look, it would be nice to have the rich individuals that live in this community, because they recognize it's a very great overall resource of wealth that lives in that particular quadrant of the state that we often don't talk about in the context of New Mexico politics, that we actually have a lot of wealth and it's relatively concentrated in the particular areas of our state. They said, wouldn't it be nice if those folks invested in the community and the people that live and work in the region? And we also heard that it would be great if other companies beyond the oil and gas industry look to put their workforce opportunities in this region so that individuals have opportunities beyond oil and gas, not just now, but obviously if that workforce sees that those jobs leave the state. But they recognize they're going to need some sort of job training to take advantage of the future industries that might grow in the region, that it won't just happen overnight and it's not going to happen naturally. One of the things that we looked at closely in the workforce solution study is what does the demographic profile look like for renewable jobs? If you're not familiar with this, unfortunately, if we don't do anything now to invest in the infrastructure to make sure those jobs are available for New Mexicans and diverse New Mexicans, it will look like the renewable energy workforce nationally, which is older, more white, and more male dominated than just about any other labor industry in the United States, right? So I think the workforce recognizes that. So if we want to do, as this quote indicates, to provide more opportunities for the youth, we have to make sure that there's opportunities for training and higher education available to them in their community. They shouldn't have to come all the way to Albuquerque to the University of New Mexico to study under folks like myself and Dr. Sanchez Youngman to get opportunities for that education. Next slide, please. Final theme from the data, and we wanted to be very intentional with our opportunity to speak specifically with frontline workers in the oil and gas industry. We wanted to find out if there are any specific insights for the state, and particularly when we think about the role in just transition. So our final theme is looking specifically at what we learned when we asked folks very pointed questions, both in the focus groups and the survey specifically about what the state could learn from their experiences, their attitudes, so forth. Next slide, please. One of the things that was a major theme, both from the survey as well as the qualitative data, is whether or not we're asking them if their voices are being included in conversations with the oil and gas industry, or whether or not their voices are being included in policy discussions with the state of New Mexico. You see, the take-home message is that the oil and gas workforce does not believe that their voices are currently being heard. 77% of the workforce in the survey indicated that they do not believe that the owners of oil and gas companies include the opinions of oil and gas workers and their families and decisions about policy in southeastern New Mexico. And 55% indicated the same thing in terms of oil and gas workers and their families being included in policy discussions specific at the state policy level, right? So at the end of the day, right, we all know policy decisions are being made, conversations are being had about what the future of this region and the overall state of New Mexico will look like in terms of energy production and all the jobs associated with that. We believe pretty intuitively part of the very important stakeholder conversation needs to take place with the actual workforce that's probably going to be impacted more than anybody else because they're the folks doing the very difficult jobs right now in the oil and gas industry. Next slide, please. And again, very positively, right? We heard loudly and very clearly that these folks are hungry to be involved in those conversations. They're very interested in having their voices heard. They have great ideas. In fact, across both studies that we've conducted, I've learned a lot of insights about some of the challenges that they face and some of the things they feel would be helpful in preparing for this transition and making sure that those folks on the ground have opportunities for new emerging industries and are able to provide for their families. Folks have indicated that at the end of the day, they know this is not going to happen overnight, but that the workers need to be included and represented in those conversations, right? I think the main take-home message is you've seen overwhelming and enthusiastic engagement from this segment of the workforce. They just need to be asked and given opportunities to come to the table. I know they work long hours. I know they've got a lot of demands on their time, but we figured out a path to be able to have one-on-one and in-depth conversations with them. I think other stakeholders can learn from us on how to find paths to be able to collect information and learn from their wisdom and their experiences as well. Next slide, please. Final couple of slides here. I think this is probably the most important substantive information that you can gather as you think about what are the priorities for just transition specific from, again, frontline workers and their families. And you see overwhelming importance across a wide range of things that could be made available by the state of New Mexico and other stakeholders. You see almost every single person surveyed believes that it's important that the state should ensure that there are health and safety standards for both the oil and gas industry, and importantly, for clean energy workers as that industry develops to protect workers. So they're very forward thinking and very intuitive, right? They're saying, look, if we're facing extreme difficulties in terms of dangerous jobs, not enough safety trainings, let's figure out how to get that right as we move towards renewable energy and other job opportunities. Let's not repeat the same pattern. Let's put the safety protocols up front as they start to develop so that we don't have the same reality with the different industry 20 or 30 years down the line. You see overwhelming support for ensuring that there's training for New Mexicans who want to work in clean energy industries to ensure that they have the certifications needed and experience required to obtain jobs. Good news here from our prior workforce solutions study, we found that there's high paying jobs available that can sustain the overall livelihood of these workers at relatively low levels of education. In fact, some of the biggest gaps in terms of income levels between clean energy jobs and any other industry are really at the associate's level and below. So we're not talking about just engineers here, but we have to provide folks with opportunities for certificates, job training opportunities, et cetera, to make sure they have access to those jobs and they don't go only to out-of-state workers as that industry and others begin to develop. You also see high level of importance for providing economic support for oil and gas workers, including, and this is a key one that I'm hoping to have the opportunity to conduct research on in the future, unemployment benefits. You saw a very, very small segment of this workforce, as well as many others that work in tangential industries related to the oil and gas industry, that work as consultants, right, and are not full-time employees, also do not have access to unemployment benefits. And we all saw firsthand what that did to families during the COVID era, when so many folks didn't have access to unemployment and really struggled. We have tons of survey data on that if it would be useful for the committee to see the consequences of what happens to families when they don't have access to that resource. And finally, last couple of things to note on this slide, you see strong support for ensuring that the state should combine up-to-date training on clean energy for workforce in existing fields, such as manufacturing, construction, and maintenance and operations. The long story short here is these workers already have the skill set, right? Because they've worked in a very related industry. They have the expertise, they have wide-ranging experience levels, but we have to figure out how to make sure they can translate that experience into the new emerging industries, such as renewable energy, to make sure they have a front door to those opportunities and don't have to wait as other folks from out of state and elsewhere move into the region to try to access those jobs. Next slide, please. And then final slide from me, if folks haven't seen me present often because we're presenting sometimes very sobering data. I mean, I'm sure like all of you, when you look at the data on the accident levels, that 26% of folks know somebody personally who's died as a result of an accident. I always like to close out with something positive that we can glean from research like the report that we've conducted out of our team at the Center of Social Policy. And one thing that's incredibly clear is these folks, again, as Shannon noted at the onset, have been here for a long period of time, have established family roots in the region. They see the Permian Basin as their home. You see that the overwhelming 95% of folks that we talked to indicated they would like to stay in the region if they can find employment beyond the oil and gas industry. So the long story short is incredibly important region to our state. I did not even recognize when we look at just population density over time. As Dr. Sanchez-Youngman noted, this region is essentially keeping our overall population numbers, at least in a positive direction, right? We need to think deeply about how to keep this workforce that's incredibly important to our overall economic base in the state of New Mexico in the region by ensuring they have access to the workforce training to survive and sustain their families well beyond the oil and gas industry, potentially leaving the state. Hopefully this has been helpful. I greatly appreciate your audience. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Sanchez-Youngman, Marcela Diaz, and Somos un Pueblo Unido.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sanchez-Youngman, and James and other SEAC members for even inviting us to participate in today and for being willing to do this in a hybrid way. We think it's so important that people see folks who are directly impacted in real time and get to connect to them. I just We started late, so I'm going to go through my little piece very quickly, and that is just because we really want to hear from the members of Somos. Who is Somos Un Pueblo Unido? We're a 27-year organization that has been organizing immigrant workers, including oil and gas workers and other essential workers in our state. And we started organizing in southeastern New Mexico in 2005 when we started building a campaign to help undocumented students access in-state tuition and college resources. That's sort of our birth in southeastern New Mexico. But as we continued to organize there, we realized that people were really hungry to be a part of social change. We're really hungry to have decision-making influence in their community. And we started starting to see some of the problems that inspired us to invest more resources in that area. We're in 8 counties across the state, 7 are rural. We have membership teams that are made up of our familias and essential workers and low-wage workers throughout the state, and most of them are rural. We decided to start building membership teams in 4 counties in southeastern New Mexico because we saw the changing demographics. Even 10 years ago, 12, 13 years ago, when we started investing heavily as an organization, we saw growing numbers of Latinos and immigrants in industries that were absolutely essential to our economy. We wanted to have this presentation here in the Roundhouse because we want to be a visual reminder of the impact that immigrant oil and gas workers have on our state budget and our educational system as a whole. Our budget and our educational system comes at a cost, and it comes at the cost of lives, safety, well-being of people, most of whom are people of color in the southeastern region, most of whom in the most dangerous jobs are immigrants, both documented and undocumented. What we also saw in the Southeast, in addition to the things that were mentioned in the presentation, was that just a very little investment, despite the wealth that Dr. Sanchez talked about, very little investment in our communities, very little investment in the social infrastructure of familias. And so we are very aware of how much our families contribute, but how very little we get back. And that is something that we're interested in changing, and we know that you have to organize to do that. Few economic resources. One of the things that we also started seeing was that our families have lived through boom and bust cycles already. So even though we have higher incomes during on years, we have to make ends meet during the off years. And that can be really difficult and propel people very quickly into poverty in our communities. The other thing that we've noticed in the Southeast that we're organizing around is we have very little institutional support. So none of our members who work in the industry are unionized, for instance. They can't go to their legislators or politicians. They feel very underrepresented, as was also mentioned in the presentation that the Dr. Sanchez's and Youngman gave. And so we know that, our institution is Somos in the Southeast, and our organizers that are there from the community have had to do a lot of work. They are doing the hard work of organizing low-wage workers, undocumented immigrants in a climate of racism, xenophobia, fear, retaliation, disinvestment, injury, and death. So I just want to recognize the incredible work that Somos organizers and members are doing in that whole region. Some of them are here today, and others are on Zoom. So with that, I want to introduce 4 of our members. 1 is on Zoom and 3 are here, who are going to read their statements in 1 in English, no, all in Spanish. But for the sake of time, you've been distributed, if you don't speak Spanish, so that we don't have to do consecutive translation or interpretation, we can do simultaneous, so you'll be able to hear them as they're speaking. And so we just want to make sure that they work before we start, and we're going to start with Marco Carranza.
Thank you, Marcela, y bienvenidos a todos ustedes gracias por haber venido aquí, y por favor siguen ustedes con sus testimonios.
Buenas tardes, mi nombre es Marcos Carranza, vengo de Habs, Nuevo México, pero soy originario de México. Tengo 16 años viviendo en Habs, Nuevo México. los mismos que tengo trabajando en el petróleo. También mis hijos trabajan en el campo de petróleo. Soy un labor hand, asisto para construir las líneas de gas y petróleo que a veces explotan y han causado accidentes permanentes para mis compañeros. Como ven, suena peligroso y es peligroso. Este es mi trabajo diario. Mis días de trabajo, igual que los días de mis hijos, empiezan muy temprano y terminan muy tarde. Y cuando hay trabajo, tenemos que estar preparados para trabajar largas jornadas de trabajo y nos dan muy poco o nada de entrenamiento y medidas de seguridad. Solo nos dicen que firmemos el curso de entrenamiento sin tomar el entrenamiento y nos mandan a los campos petroleros. También muchas veces nos dan el equipo, no nos dan el equipo adecuado para todos los trabajadores. Tampoco tuve apoyo económico o de salud por si pasa algún accidente o emergencia. Yo estuve 16 meses sin trabajar y no me dieron desempleo. Las compañías de petróleo se lavaron las manos. Además, las largas jornadas de trabajo sin descanso. Dos jóvenes murieron recientemente dentro de un tanque, un track tank, por no traer el equipo adecuado. Estas son vidas tratadas como desechables. Esta es mi vida tratada como desechable. Una justa transición es enfocarse e invertir en los trabajadores como yo, en el que este estado depende tanto como de los ingresos que traigo de mi labor para que podamos obtener más oportunidades y condiciones de trabajo seguras y programas económicos para que puedan apoyar cuando hay emergencias en el ciclo, auge y caída, mereciendo más oportunidades que sean adecuadas para ellos y para sus familias, no seguir exponiéndose a esta industria tan peligrosa. Ya es tiempo de que la familia y yo podamos sentirnos estables y seguros y felices en nuestro hogar y trabajo en Hubs, que tanto soñamos con tener cuando veníamos de México. Muchas gracias.
Gracias, Marco. And I'd like to introduce Eduviges Hernández.
Muy buenas tardes, gracias por tenernos aquí. Mi nombre es Edviges Hernández. Hoy vine desde Hubs, Nuevo México. Soy originariamente de Zacatecas, México, y llegué con mi familia a Hubs hace 19 años. Queríamos que nuestros hijos tuvieran más oportunidades económicas de estudio. Pensamos que aquí lo encontraríamos. Tengo 5 hijos y todos viven en Hubs, Nuevo México aún. Igual buscamos oportunidades económicas para nosotros, para poder cuidar a nuestra familia. Mi esposo tiene más de 10 años trabajando en el petróleo. Él trabaja arreglando los trailers y camiones que vienen llenos de tierra contaminada. Y a veces tiene mucho trabajo, pero no hay, a veces cuando bajan los precios del petróleo, lo despidieron y por nuestro estatus no pudimos pedir el desempleo. Tenemos 5 hijos menores de 12 años. No teníamos ninguna fuente de ingresos. No podíamos pagar nuestro gas, no podíamos pagar nuestra agua. Eran cosas que mis hijos necesitaban. Durante 3 meses comencé a vender tamales para traer dinero que pudiera usarlo para pagar nuestras cuentas de gas y agua y comida. No siempre era suficiente, pero no tenía otra opción. Teníamos que hacer lo posible para salir adelante, ya que no teníamos alguna protección de desempleo. Durante los próximos años veremos las caídas de los bajos trabajadores del petróleo y a otras veces no nos quedarán sin ingresos. Ha pasado y seguirá pasando. Los trabajos petroleros no son seguros. No siempre hay trabajo y un día ya no va a haber aceite ni gas y nos quedaremos sin nada de nuevo. Nosotros, los trabajadores inmigrantes, somos los que trabajan en el petróleo. Somos los que exponemos nuestras vidas, pero no nos dejan sin nada. Cuando no tienen uso de nuestros cuerpos, mi esposo se expone cada día a la tierra que viene de los camiones y trailers, está contaminada. Le caen los ojos y le daña. La tierra también daña su piel, le cae y le pica. Y la tiene que vivir con eso. Su trabajo no importa nada a su salud. Nosotros no tenemos acceso a seguro médico, no proporcionamos su trabajo y es muy caro ir al doctor. No tenemos suficiente dinero para pagar una aseguranza ni tampoco una visita al médico. Como inmigrantes no tenemos derechos, nuestras comunidades inmigrantes no tienen otra opción de trabajo, no hay diversidad de trabajos. Cuando nuestros hijos crezcan van a tener el mismo futuro y no es un trabajo que dañe sus cuerpos y un inestable y un jefe que no le importe su bienestar. Nosotros no queremos eso. Vamos a luchar por algo más. Necesitamos algo más. Mi comunidad es la que sabe las realidades de las carreras petroleras. Nosotros sabemos que necesitamos una transición justa. Los trabajadores inmigrantes, petróleo y gas quieren formar parte de esa transición y tomar decisiones por nosotros mismos. Merecemos tener una voz en la lucha. Muchas gracias.
Gracias, Rudy and Gladys Salcedo. Do you want to go last? ¿Quieres ir al último? Oh, muy bien. So we have on Zoom, we have with us Armando Espinosa. So I think this is the first time Zoom, so we have, so let's see how it goes.
Armando, ¿se puede quitar de mute?
Is he iPhone 11?
Oh, there we go. Sigan, por favor.
Mi nombre es Yo tengo viviendo 42 años, soy de Villa Hidalgo, Durango, México. Me vine a House porque aquí estaban mis hermanos, mi tía, y me platicaban las oportunidades que hay. Me vine buscando lo que se llama el sueño americano.
Referring here, and I was coming after the American dream, seeking more opportunities, jobs, and now all my family is here, including my parents and my kids. I've been working in the oil and gas industry for 20 years. I started working on the floor on the machines, and then I went up to becoming an operator. When I started working in that field, everyone started showing us how to do the job, and we were taught that there's a lot of dangers due to the pressure of gas, and we work on everything, on the machinery, on everything, and we don't have benefits. It's too dangerous, and I've never had access to medical insurance, and I haven't had access to unemployment either. In 2009, they fired me because they had to do a different job. I lost my job, and I had to pay for my bills week after week. Then they spoke to me and they told me that I qualified and that I had to return the money. And up to this date, I'm still paying it off. I continue to pay. I had to return all the money, and they told me when I had to do that, and I'm still getting unemployment, and I decided to continue to work in that industry because they paid well. But the reality is that we are victims in the industry when there is no work, and we don't have any unemployment or financial support. We all expose our health. A lot of us die from accidents because we were not trained.
A día y somos los que quedamos nada
And-
de tiempo, regresan algo los jefes, se quedan con todo el dinero y
And
nosotros
then
seguimos.
the owners keep all the money, and then we don't receive anything. We want a just transition. We need new and more jobs. We need more benefits,
Nosotros
and
seremos parte de la transición
we
y formaremos parte de los nuevos
are
trabajos.
merciful, and we will participate of new jobs, but they weren't able to give us any new jobs. As a immigrant and worker in New Mexico, we maintain the economy, but then we're left without a job. Or when we get injured, you know, it's time.
Ya se desperdió todo este orden.
He lost his place.
Ya se movió todo.
Hasta ahí, por ahí está.
Oh, I think I lost myself.
Me voy.
Okay.
Nosotros no queremos
We don't want that. We're gonna fight for something else. We need something better. My community really knows the reality about the oil industry. We know what we need. We need a transition, fair traffic immigrant workers in the oil industry want to be part of this fair transition and make decisions on our own. We deserve to have a voice in this fight. Thank you. And excuse me, I got lost. Thank you, Armando. Thank you. Don't worry about it.
Buenas
Saucedo.
tardes, mi nombre es Gladys Saucedo. y
No,
tengo-
my name is Gladys Saucedo. I have been 16 years living in New Mexico. I am from Chihuahua, Mexico, and I have 3 children. And I started with Somos a member for about 10 years, and I am organizer in Comington for 10 years. I am talking about the reality about the southeastern part of the state, the communication, and on the state depends on the oil industry, but no one ever talks this industry depends on. It depends on us, the workers, our families, the Latinos, immigrants, and undocumented workers. We as family, we're hardworking families. We know the problems in this oil jobs, because my husband works in these fields. He started from the bottom, and he has worked in the 3 positions, in the hardest positions in the industry. That's why the obstacles are many, because they don't have any trainings or any safety. We have members who have lost their lives in explosions, and they leave their children or their families without anything because they are very low income. They didn't have any stimulus check. They didn't have any benefits, any unemployment benefits. And that's when these companies, they have very low production, like when the pandemic started. This has made it difficult for our communities. We lost everything and all our savings too. The worst part of this, they were against all of this, is that the owners of this company, they know how our community work. The extreme temperatures. My husband, for example, had been working more than 18 years in the oil industry in Hobbs and North Dakota. And thanks to this, the boom, I have to have a mom and dad for my children because her father works many long hours in this industry. I almost never see him, and he cannot really spend quality time with his children. And during the pandemic, it was the only time he was the one of many that lost his job and didn't have any unemployment because of his immigration status. And we need better benefit. They didn't have options to study and had to move to Albuquerque to study and work. As a family, it's difficult to be separated. We have built our home, and it is not fair to have to leave when we have no other jobs that can help us pay and to support our families. Fair transition could be be better so we could have better jobs and opportunities. Opportunities, but the most important thing, not to have to leave our homes, which is jobs. Thank you. Thank you.
For listening to our full presentation. The only thing I would want to close with is that after organizing for so many years and really starting to create hope in the ability of our community to stand with each other, to reach out to allies, to reach out to legislators. What we know to be true is that the status quo is not acceptable. Our dependence on this industry is killing us, it's hurting us, it's disrupting our families. And so we're just thrilled that you are willing and wanting to learn more directly from the community that is most impacted by our lack of transition. Thank you.
Thank you. I want to just on behalf of the Sustainable Economy Advisory Council, thank you all for your presentation, but most especially for all of your personal stories that you've shared with us, and just want to give you a round of applause for coming. And right now we're going to go to questions. They're going to be limited to members of SEAC and representatives of state governments. So I will open it up to SEAC members for any questions that you might have for our presenters. I'll just start and say that this in particular, very challenging to hear, really important facts that you found, Dr. Sanchez-Youngman. But there's also quite a bit of hope. I will also say that the Sustainable Economy Advisory Council was created and is intended to have as much community input as possible. And I can assure you that we will ensure that you have a seat at the table.
Chairman.
Yes, sure.
As a professor, you said you're going to be doing some more studies in this area. I didn't quite find it in the documentation here. It shows the large number of immigrants moving into the area. But are you going to be able to get down to actually identifying immigrant workers versus non-immigrant workers in the oil fields? Because to me, that would be a very significant number for the legislature to look at. We live on oil and gas here right now. There's no question about that. And the huge amounts of money that's being generated for the tax and everything else, they're giving a big windfall to the state that they're out there, spending right now in terms of return. But I think it would be interesting to see how much of that return is really on immigrants versus non-immigrant workers. Because right now, the story we get up here is that, we're employing all these non-immigrant, they don't do it that way, but we're employing all these people and they want further employment for the state. And how can we give this all up and all that? But I think it would be interesting if they noted that maybe a lot of this money being generated really isn't from all these workers. I don't know if we can do that, but I'm sure like to see change.
Thank you, Chairman, members of the committee. Thank you for the question. Absolutely, that's part of the goals we have of this particular study and ongoing research. This is about halfway through data collection. And at this point, don't quote me on this because my computer died. I didn't bring my battery, but I'm pretty sure 20% of who we've talked to so far are actually not immigrants, so US born workers. So if we double that, if we're halfway through the study, I think we'd be able to generate a comparison between immigrant, non-immigrant workers across everything that you've seen in this report. And then hopefully moving forward, be able to do a little bit more quantitative data analysis, whether it's with workforce solutions data or other data to make direct comparisons of workforce in that region across a number of different factors, gender being one, as you saw from the report, would be very interesting, and immigration, I think, would be another. So absolutely, that's part of our overarching longer term goals with our continuous study.
Study similar to what soccer field in Kuwait. I mean, we're looking at something similar. Extremely effective, I think, establishes some policy directly.
Thank you.
Oh, and one more question, since workforce is here. So on the workers' comp, immigrants wouldn't necessarily Be able to get workman's comp?
I'm sorry, we don't have the workers' comp program. They're an independent administration, so I just don't have a role from it. I'm sure I can tell you.
I'm sorry.
I do.
Oh, since we do workman's comp, we have to answer workforce. That's so,
Mhm.
but that's a whole separate operation, which again, I'm not familiar with how that works, but it's strange that they wouldn't qualify for workman's comp.
They do qualify for workers' comp, or they're supposed to. But again, like, there's a lot of wage theft rampant in the immigrant and mixed status community, and not just the immigrant community. There are a lot of health and safety problems that are against the law, and that we could file complaints with OSHA. And it's the same with workers' comp. People should be covered by workers' comp. The problem is when you're in a mixed status community, there is a fear of retaliation. Supervisors talk to each other. If you lose your job in one place, you might not get hired in the next. And so there is a culture of fear. And so one of the things, and that is a chilling effect, people are afraid to lose their jobs, people are afraid to get deported. And be separated from their families. And that is real. There are many studies that document that chilling effect, and New Mexico in the southeastern quadrant is not an exception to that. But we just recently, as an organization, signed an agreement with New Mexico OSHA, which is under the Environment Department of New Mexico, to be able to do more education and outreach to immigrant workers throughout the state, including the southeastern region. There really has to be a focus on not just informing workers and employers, but building in the other infrastructure that is needed to allow people to come forward, and to have both complaint-driven and directed investigations.
If you want to indulge in some ironic, or you might look to Texas attorneys to bring workman's comp. I know a lot of attorneys make their living off workman's comp. And they might be more inclined to do it in Texas than they would be in Mexico. Just a thought.
And I would add that often the benefits that come with workers' comp are very minimal compared to the injuries and that people sustain. And that's also a structural problem, an institutional problem.
Thank you so much for the presentation. Really, really informative. As an organization that kind of works in the Four Corners area, I am really interested in hearing a little bit more of how you're collecting data, and moreover, really, if you found any nuances in the type of job training. You had mentioned that it was the associate level and below in terms of being the largest gap. So as we look to make that transition in the future, I'm just wondering if you have some survey questions that maybe may speak to the areas where we can put the most investment in terms of these trainings. I know you mentioned they need to be in those communities, and that makes a lot of sense for our communities as well, because not everyone wants to travel to Santa Fe or Albuquerque. But I'm just wondering if you have anything set up in this next phase of questions to really help determine where we need to have those investments in training, either on jobs or education.
I appreciate the question. I'll let my colleague, Dr. Sanchez-Youngman, if you want to jump on any of this, please do, so I don't hog the opportunity to respond, and I will respond after it's useful.
I think you've, yeah, sorry, now I'm on. And I apologize, I'm not in person. Thank you, Chairman and the committee. I think that's a really important question that you just raised. And, Dr. Sanchez is working on the quantitative survey, and I think that's something we could do moving forward if we do more focus groups on something that does seem to be important to tease out in more detail. Predominantly the people that we spoke with, there was a range between, there were some engineers in the focus groups. We talked with a lot of people who were welders, and then a lot of folks who played other roles in the construction side of the industry. So I think it's actually great feedback Dr. Sanchez gave, and we ought to integrate that into the final round of our surveys. That's part of the reason why it's really important for us to present these interim findings. So thank you for the note.
And I'll just say a couple of things we've learned from, again, this is just part of an ongoing investment in research in this area. In fact, in your quadrant of the state, we started all this work. I think the very first project we did was with our Native American Budgeting Institute that lives at my center at UNM, started specifically looking in the San Juan region with tribal communities. So that was the very first segment of our research agenda, I don't know, some 4 or 5 years ago, that's now moved on study after study. And one of the things that we've looked at is looking specifically at what beyond just trainings, and we're thinking specifically about renewable energy transition, must be in part of our infrastructure. And one of the things we learned is apprenticeship models are very key in that industry. So one of the things that we did in our prior research for Workforce Solution is had focus groups with construction workers as well as clean energy workers to ask them about how did you get involved in this industry? What can we learn from you that have already transitioned into that space? And one of the things we heard loud and clear was, unfortunately, something we're going to have to think deeply about is really recruiting young workforce. We heard from both just construction workers across the state that have nothing to do with clean energy, as well as folks that, for example, are installing solar panels. They basically said it's very difficult to retain young workers because they go get their certificates and training, but it's all right. And I guess a lack of way of putting it, in a laboratory space in a classroom, as soon as these young people get on a building up in 20 stories high to install equipment with wind blowing, 2 days on the job, they quit. And so when we think about apprenticeship models, we're going to have to be thoughtful about who exactly we want to engage in this workforce. And young people is one thing that we heard over and over again that we're going to have to be intentional with, because just getting the certificate in these new emerging industries isn't going to be enough to not only get them a job, but keep them in that area of work for a long period of time. That's just one example of some of the things we've already found that we obviously want to continue with ongoing research.
So when we look at making these transitions, then we need to have those robust apprenticeship programming, but also make sure that we market to the younger generation. I know when I was looking to see what I was going to do out of high school, it was always go to 4-year, go to 2-year college. I think one of the things our communities aren't hearing is, the trades and how we move a sector of our folks into that space. So that would be a good, I would love to see what the interests are in some of those potential trades and maybe look at what some of these skills you mentioned, the welders and constructors, where they might be able to fit into some of those other industries.
One final thing, just on your point, we've done focus groups in the past, specifically with college students who are being trained for these type of jobs. San Juan College, for example, I remember facilitating a focus group there myself. And one of the things that we have to be prepared for is there's already myths that are being perpetuated among that segment of the workforce who are very close to graduating. And they say things like, you know what, I would love to have a job in an industry other than oil and gas, but I hear those are the only, jobs available in the state. If I want to stay in New Mexico, which most of our young people do, that's my only ticket. And so I think a lot of it is just making sure that we're overcoming some of these myths that aren't absolutely reality, because it's obviously impacting some of the decisions that young people are already making and will continue to make moving forward.
Thank you. We're gonna go to Councilor Jonathan Perry and then Glenn Schiffauer and then Rob. So Jonathan.
Thank you, Chair. And I want to thank our fellow committee members and of course our presenters there. Thank you for your information that you provided today. My name is Jonathan Perry and I'm from northwestern New Mexico, member of the Navajo Nation. The information that you provided today is very important. And I want to make a comment and then I'll follow with my question. In regards to the importance of our communities and local people being involved in these types of discussions, I completely agree. I believe that in order to make a lot of these initiatives and plans successful, we have to have the local population involved, our neighbors. They need to be sitting at the table. And we have a lot of bright individuals across the state of New Mexico. A lot of our community members, regardless of their background, provide valuable information to these discussions. The initiatives, these plans that are brought forward from a higher level, they still need to go through our communities. They need to share the information with everyone that's impacted by decisions to be made. One thing that in part of your presentation, one thing that struck out to me was the discussion on boom and bust, and that causes a lot on families. That it causes a lot of negative impacts, and it's hard to go through those cycles. These types of industries that we have across the state of New Mexico, we need stable jobs for our people, careers that they know they can feel secure. Families, we want our families to prosper. We want a safe community for our people. And, we have to really look at what diversity looks like in terms of the economy, in terms of jobs, expanding what we can provide within our communities. Looking at, as stated earlier, the discussion on investments, not only investing more in our rural communities, because if you look at how we seem to get funding, it seems that the large metropolitan areas get majority of the funding, and then it starts to dwindle down as you start to get into the rural areas. And as stated by our presenters, a lot of our rural communities contribute greatly to the state economy. And unfortunately, we're always the last ones to get benefits in terms of infrastructure, in terms of education, healthcare, and these types of services. Making recommendations based on presentations that are being provided is going to be very important by our committee. And going back to the boom and bust, I just want to state that it is really hard on communities, because you also have communities when they rely a lot on one industry, they at times will not be able to come back from the bust portion of these cycles. We've seen it here, and I'm sure across other portions of New Mexico, other communities have seen that, where they were so invested in one type of industry that once that industry could not recover, that there goes the community and there goes the local population. They have to move, and it causes more stress on our people. In terms of moving forward, again, expanding upon investments, but also building that partnership, really securing partnership and communication, because I think all of us, what we want is a prosperous future, a safe living environment, a location where we can have our families and our children can grow, our grandchildren. And ultimately, I think that's what's going to connect us in these conversations, making sure that we have that shared, because I think all of us here coming together, we have to remind ourselves that we all are people, we all are individuals that have value. So a lot of these policies, when they're developed, it really needs to be tweaked, it really needs to be worked on to where these transitions, even the transition to renewable and green energy, there needs to be additional steps that need to be identified in order to make it successful. And, rather that if we look at maybe regional areas where, as we talked about trainings and other programs to be started, that's going to be very important in order to make that successful, because it is true, when you have to travel hundreds of miles for these services, it causes more frustration than it does bringing solutions, and it's harder. So I completely understand where our presenters are coming from in regards to the dilemmas that they face, but I guess from the committee side, we definitely do need to make recommendations to see that these policies and budgets that are being recommended, that they reflect an actual step towards these transitions to make it really successful for our local people. So I want to thank our presenters again for sharing that information. And really, we need to look at the proper steps to take. And myself, coming from a rural community, our approach to these type of discussions are a little bit different from our neighbors that live in the metropolitan areas. So I think we bring a unique perspective on these conversations. So definitely going to be wanting to look at how we can make proper recommendations to make these transition initiatives more successful. Thank you, Chair. And my question would be to the staff is to make, please provide copies to the committee members of the presentations today. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you, Councilor Perry, Councilor Schiffbauer.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for bringing these stories to us today. And I would be remiss if I didn't congratulate Mr. Espinosa on his first Zoom call, because I know he didn't. Well, having done the work that I've done over the last few years with the Green Chamber of Commerce, trying to overcome the lack of transition that Marcelo so aptly stated, in talking about these communities, about the solar jobs. San Juan Community College has such a great training program, but the sense that I got in talking with a lot of people that were working in that industry is they didn't want to transition. This is the industry they love. And it's very encouraging to hear that this is not only a transition that would be supported, but is desirable by a group of workers that aren't heard from often enough, that you don't hear that we want to do this transition. And so I think that this work is so important, and it highlights our mission and how we need to work to bring those industries to the areas that need them. The Renewable Energy Industry Association, companies that are moving here are constantly calling me saying, where's my find workers? And as Dr. Sanchez said, they get a certification. That doesn't necessarily mean they're going to last. So journeyman electricians are so rare in solar installation companies now. That's what they want. That's what they need. So I'm hopeful that the work that we've done, I've done, with especially the community college that are doing this training, pull all those things together, and especially in the southeastern part of the state where Marcelo is probably our best conduit in your organization. We don't have that much familiarity on that. I did have a couple of questions for Dr. Sanchez and Sanchez Youngman. How does the oil and gas industry compare in terms of accidents with other extractive industries? And how does New Mexico's oil and gas industry rate against other states that have oil and gas industry in terms of accidents and deaths?
Shannon, you want to jump on that, or I can.
Well, I'll begin with some of what we're finding in our perceptual data within the community. We've been able to talk to some folks who participated in the oil and gas industry, for example, some workers who did offshore drilling. And what's really fascinating is that on the ground, what they say is what's happening offshore in terms of safety training is far better than what you're seeing on land. So while official policy may exist and there's a call for this, in practice, those people who are working in oil and gas on land are suffering far worse consequences compared to those who are in other segments of the industry. So I'll stop there, and Gabe, I'll pivot to you so that you can add other data.
Only thing I'll add to Dr. Sanchez Youngman's point is what we heard from folks that have had that really interesting experience of being able to work offshore and then on land is that their perception was there was a lot more federal oversight when we're thinking about offshore drilling and so forth. And they said when you don't have that federal oversight, which is essentially a watchdog to the companies, their perception was that's why you see much looser standards in terms of safety training, et cetera, for land workforce, and consequently much more accident reports. There has been a little bit of research I've seen that compares oil and gas relative to other industries, and it looks like accident levels are higher, and probably more importantly, the severity of those accidents are much higher in the oil and gas industry than other comparative industries. And so hopefully that speaks to that. The one thing I have not seen, doesn't mean it doesn't exist. It just means I haven't looked into this myself, is comparisons between New Mexico and, let's say, Texas. So that's one thing we could probably add to our report before we finish it up, to see how we compare it to our neighbor would probably be the most useful comparison.
Yeah, so just to say a little further, you know, so there's the natural accident rate, which we're hearing there's explosions. We had, people have said this time and time again, and there's often death, but the real variation, the real difference in oil and gas compared to other industries is that there's very little enforcement of policy when it comes to people working in rural areas, predominantly by undocumented immigrant workers, right? So enforcement is very, very weak. And as Marcella noted, there's a culture of fear. So when something occurs, people feel they have very little retribution or avenue to take action. And we're seeing that both with immigrant oil workers and with oil workers who have, lived and worked in those communities for generations. So in a state like ours, there's been very loose enforcement. And as we move forward with investing in infrastructure, I think the recommendation, or at least a preliminary recommendation, would be that we have to establish a stronger infrastructure as we move towards renewable sources so that we can get ahead of and prevent these kinds of injuries. This is certainly an arena that I would love to continue to work. I study health and social disparities, and this is a very dangerous field with low enforcement.
Thank you.
Sorry,
Sure.
Chairman, I just wanted to add, thank you for that question, Counselor. So it's harder to get information about injuries because, again, they're so widely underreported. It's easier to get information about deaths, and according to the Department of Labor, the USDOL, we are the second most fatal state in the country when it comes to the oil and gas industry. And so that's one statistic that we can certainly share. The other thing I just wanted to mention is, and also that the second phase of this study, I think, can go deeper into some of those statistical findings. This was really part of the qualitative piece and the worker piece. I have an article here by the Labor Market Review, which I will forward to the chair if you could get this out. And it's a profile of oil and natural gas workers in New Mexico. And so based on Department of Labor and other statistics available, it really kind of gives us a snapshot of who is working in the oil and gas industry. And some things are very surprising. And this is to your question, Counselor, as well. So it's like a 4-page report. It cites all of the statistics. And that's really how we know that about, there's slightly over 50% of people in the industry are people of color, 43% are Latino. It doesn't drill down into how many are immigrants, but we know that the vast majority in the most dangerous jobs are immigrants. And so I'll send this to you. 15% are women. I mean, these are things that surprised me. And so I'll send that paper over to you and you can distribute as you see.
Thank you. Counselor Black and then Counselor Epstein.
Thank you. Can you hear me, sir?
Yes, we sure can.
Excellent. I appreciate the opportunity, and I want to thank the presenters today, as well as the speakers who spoke during the meeting. I'm a product of the Permian Basin. My family's been in Lee County in Lovington, New Mexico since the 1800s. I have family who work in this industry and other industries in that area. But I think what I want to start with, though, I guess that really struck me is something that we all should be, I think, figuring out and focused on is immigration reform. What we're hearing in these stories are vulnerable people in communities that are being taken advantage of because of their status. And that is something I think from the business community side it's not good business practice. From a humanities side, it's not good practice either. So I think, I hope we can, continue or partner in continued efforts around immigration reform from the business community perspective. I do want to highlight some issues that were discussed, and I think it highlights both the challenges and some of the opportunities, but also why Lee and Eddy County are two of the fastest growing counties in the state of New Mexico. If you look at the median income for the state of New Mexico, it's about $54,000. In Eddy County, it is $67,000. In Lee County, it's $62,000. People are making a lot more money there because of this industry. If you look at education levels across the state of New Mexico, 28.5% of New Mexicans have a bachelor's degree. In Eddy County, it's less than 17%. In Lee County, it's less than 15%. But they're making a lot more money. So lower income or people who have a lower level of education are making better returns in this industry. And that's why you're seeing population growth and people wanting to go there. So while it is dangerous, and I in a previous life worked at Pacific Gas and Electric. It is when you work in the gas industry, when you work in the electricity industry, those are two of the, when you work in energy, those are two of the only jobs that you do that are, you handle every day something that is inherently dangerous and volatile. And it is something that is, again, growing up in that part of the world, you do hear stories about people walking into a tank that's got gas in it that's poisonous, that they didn't realize or their equipment was faulty. It is very dangerous. And I do think the level of enforcement, I appreciate what the previous speaker mentioned around, I think, the lax nature of on-land regulatory oversight and training versus drilling rigs on the water. I think there is there's probably a different level of safety ingrained in that. I'll share, but as going back to this opportunity piece, I'll share a story that's very personal to me. It's my nephew. He is a incredibly smart young man, but he was not great at school. He didn't like school. He did not make it through to get his associate's degree. He ended up as becoming an installer for then Solar City, doing solar panels. They then became Tesla. He ran some of the most successful active crews in Texas installing solar panels. He now is a journeyman electrician, but has transitioned to working in the Permian Basin. He lives in Hobbs, and he runs the electrical lines for a lot of the drilling that goes on. He makes 4 times what he made in the solar industry. Those are some of the realities when we talk about transition, is how do you build those high wage jobs? How do you attract private capital to create jobs in New Mexico? And I think we have about a decade to make this transition before the oil and gas revenues, which produce 40% of our state's budget, start to go down, according to Moody's and the LFC. So we have to make some very serious moves to diversify our economy in the next 10 years. That means we have to attract capital. That means we can't rely on the state to be the vehicle for investment. They need to be the partners of investment. So I would urge us all to understand the reality of the complexity of trying to replace a carbon-based high-income industry with other industries, because the wages in Lee and Eddy County are significantly higher for folks with lower education than anywhere else in the state. And that's going to be a difficult transition. And we have to be thoughtful about how that occurs. But again, I hate to be the bummer on that conversation, but it is, I think it's important that, and I would challenge, not challenge, but ask our researchers here today, I've been trying to find other examples of industry, of countries or states that have successfully made in regions that have successfully transitioned from a high impact carbon-based economy to one that is not. And I can't find one anywhere that's successfully done that. And people will tell you Norway did. But Norway, while they don't do a lot of the mining, they're using their permanent fund like we have, but theirs is much, much bigger to subsidize their, which is all based off of natural gas. So it's not a great example. So if there are examples of that, we really should try to learn from those during this transition. And with that, I will give back the mic to you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thanks, Councilor Black. Councilor Ashley.
I think you can hear me better here. So thank you so much. I appreciate your stories. They're very heartfelt. And I come from the Northwest New Mexico in San Juan County and have been growing up with oil and gas development literally in our backyard, pretty much 50 feet from the house that we built very proudly when my mom was given a site lease. And I know when you share such stories and you see the data that you're presenting, to me, that really helps place up front the trust and communication that had to be built to get there and to get such information. And I want to acknowledge you putting up first with language. And I think translation in that sense is very important. And I like to see that happen with our communities up in the Northwest, with our tribal communities and in Navajo particularly, because I think with that show that you can help translate, it provides that bridge of that trust. And I think when we see industry come so fast here and go away so fast, and we don't see anything in between, this is a first step in helping get us to where we want to go with that just transition. So yeah, and I appreciate all your time.
Thank you, Councilor Ashley.
If I could just say, you know, I know that this transition is going to be difficult. I know that our families are hurting with the lack of jobs right now and the boom and the bust. And, you know, with the help of your organizations, your communities, your testimony, UNM's assistance with providing the data, because that's really what our legislators, that's what a lot of our leaders look at. Show me the data before I make a decision. So I just want to be very open and saying thank you so much for being here, for sharing your stories, because this is the first step in creating that change that your community needs, our community needs, the state needs to understand that oil and gas is ramping down. And we need to really ramp up the solutions and have that just transition for our community. So I just want to say a very heartfelt thank you, Kahat Doa, for being here today.
Thank you. We're going to move to public comment. Is there anybody on Zoom or in the audience that would like to make any public comment?
Chairman and members of the committee, my name is Sophia Martinez. I'm from Mora County. If you've been watching the news, Mora County has always been in competition with Mississippi for the forest of the poor, right? And le quiero dar muchas agradecimientos a todas las personas que están aquí reclamando por los derechos humanos, ¿no?
Thank you for everyone who's here fighting for human rights. And I would also like to provide support to Somos Un Pueblo, because they're really strong in organizing.
Right now, we're in the legislature where so many bills are being pushed to keep oil and gas alive. And the reality is that there is a lot of jobs that can be formed by renewable energy and building up our transmission lines so we can do that. But there are, what, 10 lobbyists for PNM, 10 lobbyists from mining, 10 lobbyists from oil and gas, and you know, then you have the community coming up to you. So I think it's important that a sustainable department really look at that seriously And at the same time, yo hablo español solo porque mis padres vinieron con los primeros
I
españoles.
speak Spanish only because my parents came with the first Spaniards. And we've had the influence of people from Spain, people from Mexico, and we
And basically sustainable with their planting and the river that provided food, right? I was at a farming conference this morning where people were crying about the fact that they are trying to live also. Están tratando de vivir con lo poquito que hacemos. Pero al último, al final de
but at
cuentas,
the end of the day, we have to make a decision. Do we want to be rich like the bosses, or do we want our families to be healthy?
no? The first people who suffered from the testing of a nuclear bomb. To this day, they have not been included in the RECA, no, the Radiation Compensation Act, which basically would have sunset this summer had not been for the work of our indigenous brothers and sisters in the Iranian belt, right? Well, they got an extension of 2 years, but not compensation. Their grandparents have died of cancers, their parents have died of cancers. Those that are still living, many of them are in remission, are dealing with cancers, and the few lucky ones don't have it. So al fin y al cabo, if we want sustainability, si queremos sustentabilidad,
For sustainability, we have to
hay que ponerle no nomás solo en la política, porque ahí no vamos a encontrar las respuestas, because the rich, unfortunately, are not willing to share. And we have to recognize, queremos ser como los patrones.
we want to be like our bosses.
Any other public comments? Yes.
Buenas tardes, miembros del comité.
Good afternoon. I'm
Soy organizadora comunitaria.
I'm a community worker. My husband has been working in the oil field for over 20 years. As my peer Gladys was saying, but he was never at home working long hours. And he's been working in the oil field for 21 years. He would work from Monday to Saturday. And he would say that he needed to distract his mind because he saw a lot of accidents, very ugly stuff. And at that time he was playing baseball. But his body is becoming more and more damaged because of his work. And because of the strong chemicals, he would get home with his eyes hurting. And then his knees would be hurting because of the type of work he did. And after 15, 18 years, he couldn't play baseball anymore. And 80% of people who work in the oil field have health problems, and that's why seeing the graphs, I realized that a lot of people abuse drugs to be able to put up with working for long hours. So the young people who are starting that job now, you know, they're going to want to be able to do a sport, but then after a few years, they're going to have to abuse substances so that they can keep going. The other problem is that not having the right immigration status. They can't do certain things like driving trucks. And so other people who are citizens can keep you know, prospering in their job, but those that do not have that documentation cannot. My husband works from Monday to Friday. He's 57, but he can hardly make it to Fridays. And as my peer said, you know, we're trying to make our families being able to make ends meet. Before, my husband used to work Monday to Saturday, and he was never at home. But now that he's at home, all the ones that are still working when they're home just for a day and a half, all they want to do is rest, and they want to distract their mind from so many accidents that they've witnessed. Like last year, on the ice, my husband slipped, and from then on, he's felt more anxiety, and he's more afraid working during the winter, but he's done this job for over 20 years. But, you know, they can't see things getting any better. And they can't go up in their position because of their immigration status. So, you know, there are a lot of women like myself that are trying to make families make ends meet. We have to go out and work, and we see husbands that are losing their health more and more. And, you know, all our husbands are really tired now, and they don't have any energy to do anything anymore. And it's really sad because they're never going to be able to enjoy better jobs and, you know, stop doing like hard labor because of their immigration status. Others have been able to do that, but we haven't been able to do that. The people who have been working 9-10 years in that industry. And we see that after that amount of years, the people who do have better benefits and better job positions, but we don't because of our immigration status. Thank you for listening to my testimony. Thank you for hearing me. Could I make a comment? Yes, go ahead. So what Armando was trying to say is that he worked a lot, he got unemployment, but now he has to pay back. They said he wasn't a candidate for unemployment, so he has to pay it back, and he's still paying for it. And other people said that yes, that they do get a good check when they do get when they do work, but you know, they work long hours, and sometimes they have to work double time to be able to get a good salary. We don't have the possibility of getting that kind of salary in other jobs. We cannot cover our expenses. So there's a huge difference. Okay, they pay good in that industry, but what's the cost we have to pay for it? Now they were saying that 40% of workers work in the oil and gas industry, but we don't see a cent of that money that is earned in that industry in our community when we are doing the work.
Good afternoon. It's good to be here. My name is Janice Peterson. I'm from Dallas, New Mexico. And again, and thank you. We all speak on behalf of how we feel and how our community are in need of help. And regardless of what kind of job we have, regardless of what kind of life we're making or living styles, I think every business needs to know where a human being as much as they are. You know, we need to make a difference of where we're standing. We struggle every day. You know, we go to paycheck to paycheck. I think they need to know that, you know, we're the ones making a difference for them to make the job better for them. I think we need more respect and more appreciate what we do for them. So that's where I, you know, like to make a comment on it, because I'm from Gallup, New Mexico, and I see Gallup. I'm on my 4th generation in Gallup. So I see a lot of things are changing. And thank you for being here and listening to our presentation. I see a lot of things that are happening, regardless of what kind of business it is. But thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Moving on in our agenda, there aren't any updates, so I'll entertain a motion to adjourn. Joe, thank you. Second. Glenn, thank you. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Thank you all. We appreciate all of this. And thank you all for joining on Zoom. We resume our next meeting 4th Tuesday, 3 p.m. of every month. Thank you.
Okay.